So I know we're kind of just taking, we're a little short on time, so I'm going to breeze through. So as April said, designing week. So this is about a project in Trenton, New Jersey, and looking at this history, right? So Trenton is an absolutely redlined area. This is downtown Trenton. The river is here. You have one green lined area, which it was at the time had racial restriction. And then you have this huge core, which gets redlined. One thing to point out is these areas that are kind of white or hashed areas are industrial or commercial areas that, this is a residential map, but basically if it's close to redline areas, it's also going to be in essentially a redline zone. This is where the project is starting. So it's a neighborhood called Colport, and it's kind of hard to see, I'm sorry, but this is, again, it's a dense, thriving neighborhood. There's a huge retail street here, a lot of culture going on here. A lot of times it was referred to Colport and what was also called Goosetown, the second downtown of Trenton, and largely the black community of Trenton. But here, once it gets redlined, right, and we get into that era, great, beautiful architecture, right, we're going to say the slums are going, and here's this kind of Jetsons-looking city that's going to replace it. And this is going to be the future this is city planning at its best, right? And so we bulldoze Colport and Goosetown. So here's what it looked like before. It's kind of hard to see, but these are dense blocks, a thriving working class neighborhood. This all just gets bulldozed, completely cleared. Colport, the neighborhood, goes into the river, becomes Duck Island. Duck Island is kind of the grave of Colport. And, but that city never gets built. The funding goes, we don't know, it dried up. And this sits as fields for a long time. And eventually gets filled with municipal buildings, the police, deep, impoundment spaces, eventually the courts, and corporate the dreams harness, right? And you see just this huge displacement of livelihoods, of a thriving culture, there's all of this just get obliterated really for nothing. And what happens, right? This is part of the system of this investment in these neighborhoods and these places, right? Here's a postcard. This is kind of underneath this, but you can see State Street in Trenton, a thriving, dense, growing city, right? Reduced to an abandoned blocks, these kind of quote-unquote high crime areas. And so in the midst of that is the East Trenton neighborhood. And there's this parcel of land which used to be a rail spur. And it's, this is right over here is where this is all cleared. And they put a lot of things that people didn't want in their neighborhood here. You have the soup kitchen, a homeless shelter, and other homeless services here. And this rail spur becomes this empty lot, trap-strewn, abandoned lot.
Is there an incinerator there?
It's not right here, but you do have a tremendous toxic legacy to this space. Right up here used to be where Lennox.
It was called Pottery Row.
Pottery Row. A huge amount of dishware originally was manufactured in the neighborhood.
Medical standard plumbing.
Yeah. So that, of course, all leaves, right, and remains empty. So you get this lot, and the plan was, let's put a impoundment and dump here, and scrapyard right in this neighborhood, really going to continue to solidify this as an area of disinvestment. And some partners of ours, the Watson Institute, which is an amazing group out of Trenton, Thomas Edison State University, and DNR Greenway and others said, what if this space became something different? And so they began a project to create an urban farm there. And at some point I'm passing on to you.
Okay.
Which is flagged. so this, they remediated that site, cost a tremendous amount of resources, connecting the farm and the urban farm and the agriculture there to the soup kitchen, and that project, neighbors, right, and friends who are in the neighborhood began connecting to that project. And at this point, they asked us to step in to start actually, this was something that in some ways some people in the neighborhood felt they just plopped in without asking, without connecting. And so that's where we came into the project to say, how could this be different? How could this really be a moment of transition for the neighborhood into a different future that benefits everyone? So I'll pass it on.
So when we're brought into this project, of course, the first question we ask is, what was the process that sort of created this amazing space of remediation, green space in an area that has long been forgotten? Where are the documents that we can access to understand why is there this sentiment that it's not for me in the community? What's going on that people aren't really activated or spending the time in the space? How are you inviting people into the space? What decisions did they make around having this in the space? So it really when we were told nothing was done, but we thought it would be a great idea to bring an urban farm into Trenton. Of course it's a great idea, but who is we? And who's part of that we? And so in our process, we began to ask, how does perception, the built environment, human needs create a lived experience? And this is what we were posing to the Watson Institute, who's a think and do tank, and asked, how do we as humans empathize with histories that have happened, that have scarred a space? Why is it that those histories create certain reactions when people see new things happening or not happening in their communities? And what we just learned was that perception finds its way into decision-making process, right? We see that we've created geographical footprints in America that have created the hyper-segregation that we're experiencing now. So the perception was we're doing something for them, and they should basically appreciate and be glad that someone is doing something for them. How is that perception meeting human needs? How is it really addressing equity? How is it really addressing inclusion? And how is it cultivating a built environment that meets human needs but really is about justice and inclusiveness? So we began to frame sort of our participatory design process around this trajectory. And at that time, we were also looking at the Regional Planning Association's fourth report that they issued in 2017, and basically talking about transit-oriented development and how places have become so astronomically unaffordable in places like New York that we have to push out of New York and go into states like New Jersey. Paterson, New Jersey is specifically mentioned in this report. But Trenton also sits on a transportation line, the Amtrak and New Jersey Transit. It really it's an hour train ride to New York City, and it's a 20-30 minute train ride to Philly, and 75 minutes to Baltimore. It's a very quick transportation corridor. So they begin promoting sort of transit-oriented development in a way that is now creating a speculative frenzy in places like New Jersey. So what does that mean? When you release a report and not have a contingency plan in place to understand what is the value of transit-oriented development, it creates a speculative frenzy of people coming in to buy lots and land at very depreciated prices. Are they buying them to do something immediately to change the conditions of places in Paterson and Trenton? No, they're sitting on it, waiting for the things that need to happen. What happens when you buy low and you then develop and prices go high? Does it benefit the people who are on the front lines of this history? Does it benefit any of us in this room to have to keep these conditions continuing? So this is a segment that they've come to acknowledge, but how do you actually take increasing civic engagement and about the planning process to a very on-the-ground level? So in Trenton, what we did is we began posing this question not as an urban farm, but as an opportunity to redefine land tenure in places that have historically been disinvested and sidelined and marginalized. That reframing of the language, along with popping this exhibition in storefronts throughout the city of Trenton, at public libraries, at block parties really began to create a groundswell of support for this project. And people began to sort of understand that this was an opportunity to look at land differently. And how do we become owners and stewards of a land rather than just a CSA shareholder, or I can use my SNAP card to go and buy produce, because that's the framing of food scarcity and food deserts in our communities. Not how did we get here. So what 4 years later, and $750,000 in pro bono services of actually consulting, getting architecture firms and others to do renderings with us, we have created and launched very recently what is called the Garden State Agrihood Project. The Garden State Agrihood Project is the 501c3 anchor that is using agriculture as a anchor asset within the community to drive community development in different ways. It has a component of a community land trust, and if those of you are not familiar with the community land trust takes land and banks it off of a speculative market so that we're not competing with investors coming in, buying entire blocks of Trenton right now. What we're working with is to take land and bank it. Why? Because then it's safe, and we can begin actually this process in an expedited manner. The Garden State Agrihood Project has several components. We're disrupting how traditional nonprofit models work. How does a nonprofit model work that we're more accustomed with? You get really wealthy friends or colleagues to become your board, and then you hire an ED, and then you do programming that may or may not benefit the conditions that you're advocating for, right? We don't know, but we know that you extrapolate experiences from communities, write grants on those experiences from the experts who are experiencing it, but they don't get paid for that work. You do. So what we said, that model doesn't have accountability, so we had to create the legal framework, and what this is more of a membership engagement, and you have a stakeholder, a participating membership, and a general membership, which is the community. So now you're creating this really robust board or membership space that then looks at who can, from that membership base becomes the executive council. Now you're being held accountable because there's more people involved, and it isn't just wealthy people that are totally disconnected from this community. And then what we're looking and focusing on is agriculture, land trust and preservation, education, arts and culture, participatory design, and an incubator. The incubator is where we're putting the Hockey Farm project under. Because another thing is we plan these community gardens, for example, and we notice after 2 or 3 years, many of them are not either running or sustaining themselves because people are burnt out, resources are limited. You have to change how we think about space and spatial dynamics and acquisition. So what we wanted to do was to ensure that the hockey model, which is the agrihood piece of this, can sustain itself. So what we've engaged in is looking at how all those components I mentioned, from preserving land to arts and culture to having sort of revenue generating events, using farm products to create retail products. How are you engaging a wider ecosystem within that community that can participate in the bigger infrastructure? This is extremely hard work because a lot of it has not been created. And to create the legal framework, the accounting framework, again, is part of that $750,000 investment that a lot of these spaces just don't have to bring in. So we need to change the dynamic of how we bring design and design methodologies and pedagogy into communities. So the farm will operate as a cooperative farm that has, it's a multi-tiered cooperative where there's either producers or people who just want to participate that necessarily don't want to buy CSA shares from the farm, but believe in things like understanding that this was Pottery Row and want to participate in sort of a historical conversation about the farm. These are some renderings. Right now we're considering having a community space, event space, community space, using refurbished bricks from many of the factories that are in rubble in Trenton, and how do we create a concentrated area so that when people are visiting the farm, again, it isn't just about produce. It really is about everything that we just took you through in the Undesign, the Redline exhibition, as it relates to the Coalport area. How do visitors from Princeton, New Jersey understand that when they activate and spend their money on this farm, they're supporting this bigger project, not just getting some really great tomatoes or corn from the area. Is this where you step in, Braden? Okay. Sorry, the tag teaming here.
So, but this connects to this vision, as April's saying, right, of how does the farm not just be one space, but actually then leveraging that as a turning point for the neighborhood and creating a space to move forward in a new vision for how this neighborhood can develop. And undesign redlining, right? How do we create these ownership models, these systems and structures which are complex, that can start to, instead of speculative investment pouring into an area close to transit that's going to displace people, we actually see wealth building, we actually see connecting to this process, designing it from the ground up, and leadership of it by the people who are there. And as what's over in the exhibit as well, right? How that becomes part of this vision for a different ecosystem, one in which begins in many ways, right, with our thriving community, the people that we've been working with and who are leading this process in Trenton, and connects all the way through, cooperatives and labor to education, the healthcare industry that's there, et cetera. And so, this starts to become a whole ecosystem of different projects and development in a neighborhood where now we're seeing people able to plug in, benefit from that, lead it, and also heal the wealth destruction that's happened to East Trenton, rather than causing a new wave of displacement. Here's the train station down here, and you have North Clinton Avenue, which runs straight up through the neighborhood, connecting down to the train station. And downtown is kind of to the left of this image. And so, right, and trying to promote that with the mayor's office, with others, with the county, as a new model of development. And the question that we'll leave off with here is what is the connective infrastructure and the design infrastructure and the engagement infrastructure that's missing from our neighborhoods? Mm-hmm. Because where do people go if they want to see this happen? Where do people plug in? This isn't in our neighborhood. There isn't a space to go. Many of the design decisions, even at a quote-unquote community engagement meeting or planning meeting, right, have already been made as to how this system is going to roll out, right? And you can decide maybe the color of the slides that go at the playground. And that infrastructure needs to get built. And so that's one of the things that we really promote through RAvB and through other projects, and we're hoping to do a lot of that work here in Baltimore as well. And see that connected infrastructure that here comes everybody, way to plug in and design, and from the ground up. And so I'm just going to leave it there.
And I think can we ask questions, Christina? Or do we open it up for questions?
We're kind of
We have 11 minutes. Okay.
11 minutes.
Good.
So we can do questions.
Yeah.
It was a lot of talking. You can ask about the exhibit. You can ask about the project. Yes.
First of all, thank you all very much. I know a lot of this stuff, and I always learn every time I go to this exhibit, so thank you for the information, because I think starting with the information is a good starting point. So, question. I think one of the things that my name is Andre Robinson, sorry. I work as a developer and community developer. I run several CDCs, so I've seen this up close and personal for about 30 years of my 65 years, right, as my business. And the concept that we fight against mostly is that somehow in 1959 or 1911 or 1865, suddenly something stopped, and it was all good after that. So we make heroes of the Klan, we make heroes of all these characters who were actually doing quite a lot of damage. So if you accept the premise that behind every great fortune is a great crime, that crime is very rarely really addressed. It produced an enormous amount of wealth, and we're not even supposed to talk about that. These areas inevitably become richer and whiter. I started in TOD and creative placemaking in the 80s. I've done it in 7 cities, and Baltimore's our last opportunity to get it right. Literally, the last opportunity to get it right because of all that displaced housing. and now opportunity funds are circling us. So the question is this. Those areas that you target in those neighborhoods all start with the same best intentions. I've been there 7 times. People older than you said the very same things, and somehow we still lost the move towards equity. It was discussed. The experts are all white. The room is generally poor and black. So what would drive the opportunity in Baltimore? Take this huge educational millennial base, all the money they're going to inherit over the next 10 years, and keep that inclusive going forward.
So I think that it's not there, right, and it's not one. There's not a silver bullet, and it's not linear. I mean, it's like schizophrenic, the answer. So try to keep up. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So places like Trenton, and I think it's happening in Baltimore with the community land trust movement going on here. First and foremost, you have to find mechanisms that really allow for the preservation of land, so that if you are not immediately getting that investment in to do something on that land, you're at least banking it for the long-term usage. And that land has to be dedicated, as we see in places like New York, like Cooper Square, and we see amalgamated housing. I don't know if any of you are familiar with a limited equity housing model, where you buy into a place. Places like Amalgamated are limited equity cooperatives. They're not rental spaces. You buy into this co-op model. It allows you to stay there, but you could never, which is what is happening now with low-income tax housing credit investments. You can't buy a place and sell it for $2 million when you feel like it. It's capped. There's a little formula that you may get a little bit more, but you're allowed to live in an area that respects that we have very different income stratifications because of this history. And it's going to take 200+ years to sort of level that playing field. So community land trust is a big driver, because if you don't have the land, then it's really hard to come back and change it. And then 2, what we're trying to do with the work is really bring in stakeholders at the very beginning. So it's not just the community members, they're leading this process, but we've had enterprise community partners come to Trenton. We're influencing in the governor's office, in the mayor's office, and we're also bringing in an investment stream, because we have a critique of the investment spaces. And a lot of people, foundations, want to give money, but they want to dictate how that money gets spent. And it really misses the mark or exacerbates the conditions in communities. And it's how do we have very honest conversations? Because we're now in an era where equity, that word equity, is being thrown around. You know, Melinda Gates announces, I'm going to pledge $1 billion to gender equity. What the hell does that even mean? Like, how does it trickle down? And that process, I have to say, is so missing, because it's the hardest one to keep going. People burn out. But we don't want to put the money ahead of time in that process to disrupt what you say ends up happening, rightfully happening to communities. So there's many tactics, and we felt creating first a space that we can aggregate all of this activity in a We Lab, so anyone can walk off the street and find this out. And then starting with land, with the Grow into the Agrihood project. It's not just about the farm. There's a similar model in Detroit, the Detroit Agrihood model project. How many of you have heard of that one? And you know, it's used to create, it didn't put the limited equity piece in it, so people are buying homes at low amounts, and now the price of real estate is shooting, so it misses the intentionality of the keeping it diverse. But how do you take that and create the constraint?
Well, I'm going to leave it at that. That's exactly the point.
Yeah.
That if you look at all those, if you go back over all those places, those little camelots that we tried to build, they all inevitably resegregated around wealth.
That's right.
And that wealth tied to whiteness becomes just whiteness.
That's right.
So
and we have to start really early with the preserving it. Yep. So thank you.
Well, you are asking, I mean, you have wonderfully explained how the system has baked into capitalism basically all the restrictions and the separations and the discriminations. And that the conclusion then from that, of course, is that the only way you can counteract it is to disassociate yourself from that system. And you know, a community land trust or so are small parcels where you do that. The question is how we can kind of filter out, earlier this morning somebody talked about the nonprofit industrial complex. How can we filter out the good players? How can we filter out the benign investors? Because at the end of the day, you have described how large parts of the population were disenfranchised from building equity. And at the same, so we want to have that equity back. So increased values in
Right.
formerly redline communities would be a good thing.
So,
Except
yeah.
you have to protect the folks that are in there
Right.
from being displaced, which would take a large amount of money. So we need some kind of
Yeah, so the goal is not to create enclaves of community land trusts that are segregated from that. That's not the goal. The goal is to create ecosystems that we're all operating in and components within that ecosystem that allow for the preservation of difference. Because the systems, they're not systems of just investment or capitalism, they're systems and mentalities of racism and of value of people. What we've talked about here is how we have created hypersegregation in places like America and in Baltimore. What we're talking about here through a community land trust is that we know the mechanism of land in Baltimore, in places like Baltimore. When you buy land in depressed areas, they will go up, right? That is a good thing, but it can't just be good for a certain group of people.
Yeah, but you're overlooking that the same mechanism happens in countries that didn't have racism in that before.
And right.
Capitalism does it sort of on its own to segregate people out by class and income and all of that. So the racism is on top of that.
Right.
But it is not the only driver.
I didn't say it was.
No, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
So engaging the folks that were disengaged and make them real players that benefit from this system, that is sort of the question that I'm
Yeah, and that's
asking.
what we're doing is that when I invest, so Enterprise Community Partners is one of the largest syndicators of low-income tax housing credits in this nation. Over billions of dollars are invested into communities. So when we're engaging people like that to rethink what happens in communities, but it's a very arduous process on the ground, right? We can say come to the table, but that's what I was talking about before. There are implicit biases that people bring with them to the table that takes time to deconstruct. And it's not like people have an altruistic good, I want to do good. There has to be a knowledge shift and a mind shift in order for people to connect to the project.
Has been trained on all this?
We are working with them to try to get this done, and yeah.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more question.
Yeah. One more. Yep, we have the sign 3 minutes.
Yes.
Okay, so I want to say that our community was built by enterprise, and so we had challenges, and I'll leave it at that.
Mm-hmm.
But what really concerns me about the conversation is like, everybody always talks like we have to have either extreme poverty or it'll be extreme wealth, and never the two can meet.
Right.
And I'm thinking that as intelligent people, we should be able to develop some type of smart community, whereas we're not just going to be, our communities aren't just a dumping ground for all the met centers and just to me they're plantations, these farms and stuff, that we will have some real growth and real economic opportunity in our community, and that it'll be a diverse community
Yep.
as well.
Yep.
That people from all different types
That's
of
right.
backgrounds will be able to grow in.
That's right.
And it's not just going to be stigmatized to be just a poor community that my property value, buy my property for $100,000 and 30 years later it's still worth $100,000.
Right. Absolutely.
That's not acceptable.
That's right. That's absolutely right. By having a process, what you said, right, from us, has to have a process to manifest itself. How do you create a process that brings people in to even do things, as you're mentioning, change vernacular? We don't use the word low income intentionally, but that is a word that stigmatizes a community when they use words like that. We heard the same argument about the plantation farm model when we were doing our participatory questioning. For us, our work is really centered on a process. And again, for being in this since 2015 and showing what we're doing, we don't have every answer to it. It's not creating extremes to not allow stuff in or people out. It's really creating vibrant communities that are reflective of the difference that we see in this room today and in the streets of any city that we go to. But there has to be a process because, to your point, it starts off with the best of intentions. I don't know how many of you have seen Harlem and been to Harlem. I'm from the Bronx, and I've seen areas that no one wanted to touch, that were sold when I lived there for nothing. And now in 2013, a townhome was sold for $320,000. And in 2016, it was put back on the market for $1.2 million. Who is that? It's not for me or my family or the people who were here when no one wanted to be in the Bronx. So how do we change the dynamic of how investment comes in and how we can access that brownstone where I don't have to have $1.2 million to be able to stay in a neighborhood that no one else wanted to be in before? And that is a process. And what may work in the Bronx may not work in Baltimore. And what may work in Baltimore may not work in Trenton. So for us, it's really activating different conversations from the work that we do on the ground to bring different stakeholders to the table to create the fluidity in community.
I applaud you for that stance. That's important. But remember, I worked in Harlem for 30 years.
Yeah.
We did this in Harlem, and every one of those sites is surrounded by
And what
$2
happened?
million two-bedroom apartments.
And quickly, and what happened in Harlem? What created what Harlem is today?
Well, there's inevitability about where the capital comes from. That's number one. They were buying it by the 30-block sets while we were
When, though, where they were
in
buying?
In the 80s when nobody wanted it. But the other part of it was, and I will say this vociferously because I was there while they were doing it, the greed of this is my piece and you can't have any part of that left them vulnerable to being surrounded.
That's
They
right.
only now, today, 30 years later, have the two blocks that they started this conversation on. And they're surrounded by.
Is this the
$2 million apartments.
135th Street?
All that,
Yeah.
that whole rigmarole.
But you made a very important point, the acquisition of property,
Right.
of land.
That part's.
And that's what I keep reinforcing. Land was acquired for next to nothing, and it wasn't that in the 80s they transformed Harlem.
No.
So they sat on it
They sat on it.
until investment came in. Any other? Okay. I think we got our zero sign. Thank you so much for listening.